Hello everybody, today we have another entry in one of my favourite playlists, cool cars for young people. And what we have here was certainly a cool car in its day, and I think maybe even cooler now, because this is the car that made the Skoda badge have a bit of sex appeal. This is the first generation Octavia vRS. If today you were to tell anybody that you'd bought a Skoda, they probably wouldn't really think all that much of it. They might say to you, that's nice, or yeah, my neighbour's got one of those, or maybe even, I had one a few years ago, I quite liked it. But if you were to tell somebody 30 years ago that you bought a Skoda, they might say, oh, I'm sorry about that, or are things okay? Do you need a little bit of help? And that's really for no particularly good reason. Skoda made good cars back in the 90s, but the brand was not one that appealed. And so, knowing this, their then somewhat new owners VW embarked upon a quest to try and sex it up a bit. And to do that, they did a few very, very brave things, including a, quite frankly, genius advertising campaign that I'm sure many of you may remember, where they essentially admitted the fact that people didn't think Skodas were good cars, but now they were. And then, once people began to sort of get on board with the idea and accept the fact these were effectively the VW they already loved, just at a slightly lower price, they finished off with this, the VRS. And this was a particularly significant thing because it was their first attempt, certainly in the modern era, at a performance car. The VRS, or RS as it was badged elsewhere, not being called that here in Britain on account of the fact they thought Ford were going to get a little bit upset about it, followed much the same formula as, say, the equivalent Golf GTI. And because this is a member of the VW empire, I always, of course, have to compare it to the equivalent Golf, and for this, the Mk1 Octavia, we're talking about Mark IV Golf. There are, though, some interesting differences. This generation of Octavia landed in 1996, although I don't believe it appeared on British shores until a couple of years later. It then lasted until around 2004 to 2005, with some late examples of the VRS being registered in 2006. But I don't believe they were still building them by then. Elsewhere in the world, it actually had a fairly long life, being in production until the very, very early 2010s. The release of the VRS was timed, I believe, to coincide with the launch of the facelifted version of the regular car, both of them coming out in 2000. And as far as I am aware, there is no such thing as a pre-facelift VRS, though, internet, if I've got that wrong, please do hop into the comment section and correct me. Unlike the Golf, this car was not available as a hatchback, instead coming either as a four-door saloon or, as we have here, an estate, which I think is certainly the cooler choice, and I think actually is aged fairly well. It's not a particularly striking car, but I would go so far as to call it handsome. It's comfortable in its proportions, and none of them are particularly big. And in fact, park it in a modern-day car park with modern-day cars and it looks positively tiny, and oh my, don't I sound old saying that. Skoda did eventually do a performance hatchback, but that was the Fabia, and it was also powered in its first guise by the diesel engine, I think to try and keep some distance between it and the VW equivalents. For this, though, things actually didn't go at all how you would have expected, because though this has a member of the venerable 1.8 litre turbo 20-cylinder EA113 engine family, which went in just about everything in the VAG empire over a period of a decade or so, this one actually makes more power than the Golf GTI of the day, which I think at the time, or at least at time of launch, was stuck with around 150 horsepower. This AUQ version of the engine made instead 180 horsepower. Torque is a relatively modest 173 pounds-feet, that's 235 newton meters. Justin, this car's owner, also showed me a brochure that he got for one of these cars, which told me the top speed was 143 for the estate, 146 for the saloon, and also so bravely and I think somewhat boldly that you would never be able to mistake this for any other Octavia. I think you would. Now, there are some subtle cosmetic differences, the big ones being the 16-inch wheels, which remarkably this car still has. You could have had 17s as an option from the factory, and the little wing at the back. I'm sure there are some other tweaks to the rest of the car too, but even from the inside, there's not all that much to mark it out as something a little bit out of the ordinary. You have nice, somewhat sculpted seats that I actually really quite like. The gear lever here attached to the 5-speed manual gearbox has the V symbol on top of it. You've got metal looking pedals, they might be real, they might not, I don't really know. This weird fabric, lots of scratchy plastics typical of the day, and that's about it. Oh, Griffith, nice. That's the car you want to be out in on a day like today, though mercifully the aircon in here is blowing icy cold. And as we happen to find ourselves on a nice little slice of British B road, let's see what this car's performance credentials are actually like 24 years later. You know something? It's actually a little sweetheart, this car. The turn-in is not particularly keen. The rack is not vague, I would say. It seems a little bit harsh, but it's also not full of feeling either in that very typical VW fashion. The suspension, though, is a bit of a surprise. From the factory, this sat 15mm lower than a regular Octavia, and this has been lowered again by another 30mm, which when I read that in Justin's email, I thought, ooh dear, that's going to be horridly, horridly crashy. But actually it's not. That may be due in part the fact it's still on its original 16s with their 205/55 section tyres, and good quality brands here too, Continentals. I have been told that the main reason the previous owner fitted these KW items is because he got tired of replacing the OE equivalent ones. They apparently had a habit of snapping with an annoying frequency. Perhaps surprisingly for a slightly older car, visibility isn't quite as good as I would like it to be. This A-pillar seems actually a little thicker than you might imagine, due in part to this really big seal that they've used here. And there have been a couple of moments where actually I've nearly lost entire cars in it. This B-pillar likewise is also a little bit further forwards than I would like, although this is made up for in some way by the large amount of glass in the car, the fact the beltline is relatively low, meaning you can place it fairly easily, and the overall fairly compact dimensions. There's a little bit of torque steer to it. I have been told that despite the fact the car has the obligatory cold air intake and a dump valve from Forge, it hasn't actually been remapped and is making, we believe, standard power. And from this seat, that feels accurate. What has been changed though is the exhaust, which has had the midsection replaced with one from the 1.9 diesel, because that doesn't have a silencer in it and so allows the thing to breathe just a little bit easier. The rear section has then been taken from an aftermarket exhaust for a Mark IV Golf, which though it has the same engine, doesn't have the same rear bumper, which is why it looks like it fits quite so badly. This is something that Justin wants to rectify. Now he is a young-ish lad, 26 going on 27 I think, or thereabouts, and previous to this he had a Dacia Duster which he shared with his partner, but recently found himself in a situation where he needed a car for himself and wanted something a little bit more exciting but on a relatively limited budget. He had in the past also had a Civic EP2, that is the Civic Sport, so the cooking version of the Type R of the day, which is the EP3. I actually bought one of those for my other half many moons ago, and they're really good cars. Having then had a couple of very practical cars, he didn't want to lose that when he went for something a little bit spicier, and that's how he wound up with this, the Estate. Unfortunately, it didn't go quite so well, because he bought it privately from a chap who seemed to be quite an enthusiast. He'd owned it for some 12 years, they took it out, did a test drive, and all seemed fairly well. Then, on the way home, the oil light appeared, so He stopped, being a mechanic and mechanically sympathetic. He got out, checked the oil, and it appeared correct. And he did then what I think most of us probably would. Having checked the oil himself and seen that it was fine, he reckoned that it was probably the sensor which was instead at fault. So he continued driving, and a little while down the road, the light appeared again, and naturally, believing the sensor to be at fault, he ignored it. Which was a mistake, because only a couple of miles after that, the engine seized. We don't know exactly what actually went wrong with it, but it was bad enough that the engine had to be replaced. Which obviously is not good, and in fairness, I don't tend to hear about all that often. These engines are not impervious to failure, particularly at the age they are now, and with them attracting a crowd that like to modify things. And you'll get that with just about anything that is cheap and turbocharged. But in good news, because these are a relatively common car with a very common engine, he was able to source the correct AUQ replacement for just £370. And that's why it has the dump valve and the air filter, because it came with both of those, and as a little Brucey bonus, there's a reference for my older viewers, it even had a nearly new clutch kit too. Him being a mechanic also meant this was nowhere near the disaster it could have been for somebody else, and although he got the car on the Sunday and it failed the same day, come the Thursday it was back on the road, which I think is really very impressive. And I have to say, with the clock now showing just over 170,000 miles, this car is also definitive proof that Skoda's quality really was as good as they were trying to tell everybody. Now, young people of Britain, don't forget, if you're on the hunt for a new car, make sure to use CarVertical, because that bargain you found on Facebook Marketplace with the suspiciously low price and 2 blurry photos and unhelpfully vague description, well, it's only really a bargain if it's the car it claims to be. And to help you in the fight against unscrupulous sellers, CarVertical will search a number of databases around the globe to give you all sorts of helpful information, including a car's write-off status, potential mileage discrepancies, whether it's been used as a taxi, involved in a theft, fire, all things you definitely want to know beforehand. A CarVertical search takes just 60 seconds, and for 20% off the service, don't forget to use my discount code JayEmm. As you might imagine, a lot of this car is effectively the same as just about any other Octavia of the day, which is to say that the interior is a good size. It's not huge, but there is easily enough room for 4 adults. The boot in this estate is very generous. The shape of it is uniform because you have plenty of glass all around, and it's mercifully not tinted. It doesn't even feel all that oppressive in the back. Though the quality of materials isn't particularly high, I do recognise quite a few of the switches and bits from various other cars. In fact, I'm certain that these stalks here are also the same as you'd have got on an Audi TT of the day. And I did say to Justin, was he not tempted to swap in one of the hotter engines from a TT into this, like the BAM that made the 225 horsepower? And he said, yes, he did think about it, but first off, that might create an issue with insurance, and secondly, it's actually quite a big job. Though physically the engine will fit fairly easily, you need to get an ECU for it, the clocks will not work, and there's a lot involved in it. So he figured actually the most sensible thing was just to do a direct swap. On the topic of insurance, this costs him just over £40 a month, which is actually pretty good. In all fairness, insurance these days is so expensive for just about anything. If it's a number that sounds vaguely tolerable, I tend to consider that now a decent price. I genuinely don't know how young people do it anymore, and any 18, 19-year-old that's getting into cars and actually has managed to buy and insure one, I salute you. And though I don't think I would be recommending this to any 17, 18 or 19-year-old, by the time you're 20 or so and you've had a bit of experience of something with a little less power, this does feel like a very, very sensible next step. You have ASR, anti-slip regulation, that's early days traction control. There is an electronic differential lock in it too, naturally ABS, and in standard guise, not really enough power to get you in all that much trouble. With a decent set of tyres on it, those factory fitted VRS brakes with their lime green finish should be more than adequate enough. They're not the best in the world, the pedal has a little bit of dead travel in it, but otherwise they're very easy to modulate, and honestly this is a very, very easy car to drive, and also one you can have a bit of fun in. When you get up to speed, even with these lower springs on them, the ride quality is not actually terrible, and to be honest, 20-odd-year-olds will suffer awful things if it gets them a slightly faster car. And I know your mates aren't going to think a Skoda is particularly sexy, but this is a good car. VW parts commonality also means that just about anything and everything you need can be bought or adapted to suit. Case in point, the cup holders, which have been taken from a Mark IV Golf and fitted down here below the HVAC, which honestly is a weird place, but there is another one over here by the handbrake. However, now this car has had a centre armrest fitted, which is not a standard VRS thing. It's kind of useless. In terms of options, this car could have had xenons, but doesn't. It does have parking sensors, and there wasn't really much else apparently to choose from. But regardless, whether you want to modify or fix the car, you should be able to find just about anything and everything you need, both easily and fairly cheaply. The car will even do fairly decent fuel economy, high 20s around town, and up to about 40 on a run, which is not bad. And to cap it all off, these appear to be one of the very few genuine bargain performance cars you can still get your hands on, because if you're willing to go with something that's a little higher mileage and maybe not cosmetically perfect, you can get one of these now for just £1,500. Though do be wary when you're buying stuff like this, because there is a very good chance at that kind of price you may need to put tyres and brakes on immediately, and at that kind of price you'd be better off buying a nicer example, which for something like this you're only talking about £2,500 to £3,000 to get just about the best I could find on Auto Trader today. That would be a late example, a 2006 registered car, and honestly even if you've got nice cars already and you want something for a tip run or a station wagon, you could do a lot worse than this. So there we have it. That is a Skoda Octavia VRS Mark 1. Big thanks to Justin for bringing it out, and as ever to you for watching. Don't forget to hit the like button, comment down below, and subscribe if you haven't already. I'll see you for the next one. Bye bye.